must unite what has been set asunder.
We are TFR. Truth Frequency Radio.
Live from Melbourne, Australia, and all around the world, wherever you may be, I'm your host, Nikki Colombo, and welcome to the Nikki Colombo Show. And tonight's special guest, we have ET artist David Chace. But before we bring David on, I just want to shout out to Christine Dennett, who did a beautiful illustration of my higher self after my Kundalini experience. We've had Christine on, also known as Kasara, a couple of weeks ago. If you want to check out my archives, Christine was on for a couple of hours a couple of weeks ago, so check that out. And you can check out the illustration that she did for me on my Facebook page tonight. So David Chace is an illustrator and a researcher with a deep curiosity about UFO abduction, the UFO abduction phenomenon, and in particular the question of what the reported aliens look like. Since 1991, he has been working with experiences and attempting to draw the different types of aliens they describe. David has a bachelor degree in biology with a concentration in ecology, evolution, and behaviour. His educational background informs his research and his perspective on alien and anatomy. You're going to have to help me with that. Anatomy? Yeah. Anatomy and biology. In 1997, the nationally televised program Strange Universe featured a segment on his research. His artwork has also been seen in Fate magazine, Open Mindedness magazine, and numerous and other publications, as well as across the internet. And David Chace, welcome tonight on the show, sweetheart. So glad to talk to you. I've seen your artwork in so many videos. It's absolutely amazing. I don't think everybody knows really who you are, but they certainly know your art. Do you want to tell us how this all started for you?
Yeah, sure. So in the 80s, I was born in 70, and when I was in the 70s, I was watching Star Trek, and then of course at the end of the 70s, Star Wars, and of course Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Mm-hmm. So I was aware of the idea of space travel and beings from other worlds, and then in the early 80s, I saw the documentary UFOs Are Real, which featured Stanton Friedman and Bruce Maccabee, Ted Phillips, and the Barney and Betty Hill case and the Travis Walton case. So at that point, I started to get kind of interested in this idea of UFO visits to Earth and alien beings. And then towards the later part of the 80s, my dad took me, I think 87 probably it was, my dad took me to a lecture by Tom Gates at Monterey Peninsula College. I lived in Monterey, California at the time. And Tom Gates was a member of MUFON, and he did a presentation on UFOs. And from then on, I've been just very fascinated with the subject of UFOs and UFO occupants, which I usually call them aliens, but yeah, other terms, visitors,
off-worlders, ultra-dimensionals.
Ultra-dimensionals.
So many words for them now, isn't there?
Indeed. Everyone's got their preferred term, and that gets to, all the debates within the UFO community over, are they good, are they bad, where do they come from, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and that and the technology and who's in the allegiance with us and who's not, and yeah, it's a minefield out there. That's why we do these shows, so we can get some insider information on where we put our energy at. So, how did you start? I know your story because we met on the Starseed Awakening group years and years ago, and I was absolutely fascinated by some of the reptile stuff that you've come up with in your art is absolutely fascinating. How did that all start for you? Were you an artist as a little kid, or did this just suddenly happen to you, like years later that you started illustrating them?
So when I was like 5 years old, I was drawing animals and dinosaurs, and I was real fascinated by dinosaurs. And of course, at that point in my life, particularly like when I was 7 to 8 years old, I started going out in the woods and catching lizards and snakes and frogs and salamanders. But I was very fascinated by reptiles, and then I learned. Take you forward to the early '90s, and I'm in college, but coming home on on the weekends or the summers or whatever, and then I heard about a group, and I was going to college in UC Santa Cruz at the time, but I was my parents had just moved up to Washington State in the Seattle area, so I was up with mom and dad over the summer, and I discovered that there was a group locally in Federal Way, just a short distance away. Eileen Garnetts is she was the leader of the UFO Contact Center International, or UFO CCI. And so I was attending those groups then, or I managed to attend one or two, I guess maybe just one that first summer, because it wouldn't meet monthly, and then I'd have to work that into my schedule. But at the first group there, I met a woman named Garnett Doonan, who also had some artistic ability. So she was able to draw, like do some sketches of the beings she saw and describe them for me. And among the different types she'd seen, one was a reptilian. She called it a drac or a draco, but it was a very big, muscular. In fact, the body. She said when she looks at pictures of bodybuilders, she kind of gets traumatized by it because they just remind her of the extreme musculature of this being that she
that's a funny
saw.
association. God help all those bodybuilders out there now. That's funny, but you know what? It's true. I've heard the same stories, and we've had many starseeds and contactees on here talking about the same thing about how ferocious they are, and how muscular they are, and how big they are, and how they're kind of a bit like look like Jupiter ascending and similar to that. So was the one that you saw, was that a benevolent one or a malevolent one? Because this is what we're going to talk about tonight. We've got to get this information out that they're just not all, ferocious and negative. There are some good ones out there too. So what were you feeling when you first saw this, this Draco? Was it, a good energy or a bad energy?
So Garnett described to me her encounter with one of these beings, that she was in a base that she understood to be, I think, off the coast of Washington State, like an underground base somewhere under the water. And she was just, somehow she'd been allowed to just wander around this base, and she came to an area where ahead of her she saw a little hallway, and there was this big reptilian being standing there guarding this door. And it had the role of just being a guard, but she was walking towards it, and then she began to slow down because she realized that it was guarding this, and it wasn't going to let her get too much closer. And it kind of crouched down. It went down into a crouched posture, and in a very fluid movement, it kind of turned towards her, and she pretty much stopped at that point. And it was just very. The reptilian was dedicated to its job. It had an animalistic feel. Like, it's not something you could reason with. It was the sense was that it was it was just trained to guard this room, and it would have mauled her and killed her if she'd continued and approached that room. And at that point, a small being came and got her and said, okay, we need to leave now, and took her back to meet her primary contact, which is a tall female being she calls Astartlia. And at that point, Astartlia communicated to her, and of course it's all telepathic. Astartlia said, soon I will tell you about Vectra. And the understanding was that maybe this reptilian being is called Vectra. But I don't think, as far as I know, Garnett never got any follow-up on that. So we've referred to this particular kind of greenish-brown sort of reptilian with pebbly scales, and it has a kind of a plate, like a breastplate that's part of its body, like it's almost like a turtle shell sort of thing on the chest. Wow. And so we refer to that particular type as Vectra. Also, I can describe it has a sort of like a beak-like mouth, almost like a bird or maybe a turtle.
Oh,
and
that's interesting. I haven't heard that one before.
Yeah, that's
interesting.
Not as often. Usually it's just kind of more of a lizard-like mouth, but in that case it was kind of beak-like. There is even at the tip of the mouth, like from what would be the upper lip, there was like a little kind of an appendage that dangled down just a tiny bit, which I think is some sort of sensory organ. And then it had very heavy bone structure. And a couple years after I met Garnett, she drew this for me. The very pronounced cheekbones or zygomatic arch, and then a ridge down the forehead, and kind of heavy bony structures on the side of the skull, which I think is related to anchoring the jaw muscles. Because, of course, as you mentioned in the introduction, my background is in biology and evolution, and so I'm very interested in all the anatomical aspects of these different beings, and from an evolutionary standpoint, why they would be shaped that way, and so forth.
You know what? That's you've fallen right into alignment with with what the skill set that you've got because of all that background. So that's why, your art comes up looking so fantastic, because you've got all these fantastic ingredients to create it. It's totally amazing and so unique. And I also know that you did another one for Misha Johnston. Do you want to talk about that one as well? That is called, what's the name of that one that Misha's got? Neo or something? Or what's his name?
His name is, he said in one of his early contacts with Misha, he said, I believe the phrase was, you know me as Ayano, or you can call me Ayano. So and it's like IYano, Ayano.
Ayano.
And he's more of a lizard-like appearance, and he's muscular, but he's not like as overly built as the Vectra type was.
It's more refined.
Yeah, and
he's got more, a positive energy about him too.
Definitely very loving. Misha's described him as alternatively as either a warrior or a spy, because that the one thing he does apparently is he can infiltrate other reptilian groups, and he's kind of it's in Misha's experience, what she understands is there's Ayano's group, and then there's another reptilian faction that's working with some people in the U.S. military at underground bases, like in the southwestern U.S. And so the negative ones, you can call them, I guess, in Misha's experience. I think the term is Chukara, but that she may have different, but it's kind of that sound. And they're working with some of the military, and they were abducting Misha to these underground bases, and they wanted to know where Ayano's base was, and of course Misha wasn't going to tell them that.
Oh, that is a fascinating story. I didn't realize that about her. That is that makes sense too. Then that sounds like a MyLab experience as well, and I know what that's like as well. But I've got no idea what they were asking me about because I didn't go further into my regression with her that Misha did with me. So, but that's absolutely fascinating. So, how did that all start with you starting to actually draw the essence of that beautiful artwork that you did for Misha?
So it's based on, actually, someone had worked with Misha. I'm trying to remember, was it Chan Johnson? It was another one of the artists who did this or was doing this kind of stuff back in the 80s and 90s. I think it was Chan Johnson, or it was maybe someone else. I'm sorry, I forget. But that individual had done he'd done a sketch with Misha. He'd added some artistic embellishments, so I tried to keep it, as pure, and I had more time, I think, to work with her. Although it was more of a long distance thing, I would go back and forth with Misha on the internet and so forth. But basically, I started with Chan Johnston's illustration and then talking to Misha about things she wanted to change about it and so forth. And then eventually I got to the point where I scanned it into Photoshop and added color and light and shade and so forth. So we got a pretty good close-up portrait. And then later on, I did a body, like a full body. And eventually, like, Misha was very satisfied at that point. But then a couple years later, I think she got back to me and said, well, I think his snout is actually longer. And I was just afraid to admit that he looked that snake-like. Misha does have a fear of snakes, and so she had a hard time accepting that Ayano actually does look somewhat snake-like, and she liked to think of him more as lizard-like, but then she realized, well, there is a snake-like aspect to him as well.
Isn't that amazing how we look back at pictures and go, oh, hang on a minute. He actually doesn't quite look like that now, and you can look at things from a different perspective. I guess we all do that now with all of our artwork. We look back at it and go, wow, I have a different perspective on things now, and it's wonderful that you've actually been able to update that and illustrate that for what that is. So the one that you've drawn, you illustrated about your higher self. Now that is a fascinating picture, and I'm using that as the promo, so that will go up on the archives after tonight. But how did you tell us about that experience? If we go for, we've got about 9 minutes until the next break, but we'll pick it up on the other side if we go over. But how did you tell us the story about how you came across drawing that gorgeous one of yourself? That picture that I'm using for the promo.
Yeah. Well, that one, it's interesting how that came about. I've heard of, from people I've talked to and from other cases I've heard of, that sometimes someone will look at someone and they'll see, like, briefly their face shapeshifts into, like, a reptilian face, or they'll see, like, maybe a gray in some cases kind of overlaid over that person's body. And, of course, the David Icke theory is that person's being controlled by some evil entity or whatever. But my take on it is more like that's actually just another incarnation of that person. Maybe that's what they were in a past life, or that's another form that person has in maybe a parallel life, a past life, whatever it is. So I had an experience where I was with a close friend, and she looked at my face and she didn't tell me at the time, but I guess it was maybe a couple weeks afterwards when we were on the internet, and I had started I just found some random drawing of kind of like a round white face with some like reptilian eyes, and I decided, okay, I'll make it a little bit of a reptilian out of this being, and then as I started working on that drawing, I like showed her, and she said, well, actually, that's you. That's how I saw you during our meeting, and
wow.
And then she got back to me with details. I mean, I don't remember exactly how it unfolded, but she described The one thing she really remembered clearly was a ridge that goes down the forehead, and then somewhere up around the area of the third eye, the ridge kind of goes into a sort of a valley, and then on either side of the ridge, there's like a little depression that runs along the sides, sort of like a little valley or depression or something like that. And so that's one of the features I tried to draw on that. And then I tried to get the size of the scales approximately right. Like they were fairly small, but not like little tiny dots or something. But yeah, so this being is, I figure, another form I have in a parallel life or something. I don't quite know.
Well, you know what? We were talking to James Gilliland last week, and I mentioned how I have a real affinity or resonance with the feline races, and he said the same thing. He said we have aspects of ourselves in previous incarnations and lives that were actually these ETs from other dimensions, and that really resonated with me. And so, we have this sort of morphogenic field that I've actually seen. Like, I was looking for my aura in the mirror one day, and I saw this beautiful guru called Sri Yitsawa, who actually morphed over my face like a blueprint. And I'm like, who is this dude? And long story short, I actually discovered who he was when I was looking in my book, that's Living in the Heart by Drinvalo Melchizedek. And I went, who is this dude? And I saw him morph over my face, and I thought, wow, is that some sort of aspect of me in a past life? Because I really do have a resonance with the Hindu philosophies and the ancient texts. There were the Bhagavad Gita and the Mahabharata and all that kind of stuff as well. So I can understand how people actually see when they describe their experiences, when they say, I've actually seen something morph over my face. But in my case, I actually was looking at myself in the mirror because I was trying to look for my aura, and he just morphed up, and I went, wow, who is that guy? And what it did was it opened me up to another a level or a line of research on discovering, Hindu spirituality, and it got me to the book Autobiography of a Yogi, which is one of the first books that brought spirituality to America, and that whole history of that. And so I can really understand what you're talking about when this morphing comes along. It was very quick, but it was just amazing. And I thought, wow, I've had that kind of experience. So I understand what people are talking about when they say that they've had an experience where they see these other entities or beings, kind of come in and morph over, your face or your image, and it feels like you have an aspect of that. And that seems to be another line of self-realization, where you go out and discover who you actually are, because you're not exactly just this, spirit in the human body. I mean, there's so many other aspects to us, and we're becoming more aware of our multi-dimensionality, aren't we, David? What do you think?
I think so. I think, you can talk about reincarnation. There was a researcher named Ian Stevenson who spent his life documenting cases of children remembering past lives, and in some cases they would have birthmarks that correspond to injuries they received in past lives, as well as having memories of the person and the people around them, and they could visit the village where that person lived, and they would know who people there were, and so forth. And of course, Susie Hansen from New Zealand has written a book called The Dual Soul Connection about how, some of us living on Earth are we may be a gray, and we may also be a human, and people wonder, well, why are people abducted? And of course, it runs in family lines. That's research we know from Bud Hopkins, but we also know that from Susie Hansen and other cases, that there are cases where people remember having a life as a gray, or the grays will tell them, well, you are one of us, or that kind of thing. So there's definitely we have a connection to some of these beings aboard these craft, and you can call it multidimensional, or we have multiple lives. I think I don't think it's like we live one life and that's it.
Yeah, that'd be too boring, wouldn't it? We need to complicate things up a little bit, and not just deal with this life, but deal with all our past lives. And that's coming up for healing too. That's another one that James Gilliland we talked about last week too, is that all of our past lives are actually coming up for healing. And, and I thought, well, how is this? A lot of people ask me, how is this going to happen? Well, you get it in your visions and your dreams and your feelings and, meditations and stuff, and you go, wow, I've just looked at a little vision or a scenario about myself. You can feel that it's yourself in a past life, working out some old karma. And as you kind of awaken and become more spiritually aware, or more, more, your consciousness expands and broadens, you realize that there are other lives out there that actually need to come up for healing, because we're just going round and round and round in circles all the time, going from one life to the next, and nothing's really being healed, and everything seems to be repeating over and over and over again. And I think a lot of this energy right now is actually all, coming up for healing, so we can heal those past lives, so we can actually enter into another timeline that we create for ourselves, which doesn't really have all the baggage and the ball and chain hanging behind us. We need to clear out all that trauma and make way for the new to come in, so all this lovely light can come in and fill us up and make us a little bit lighter, considering the world is so heavy and dark right now. So we've got about 30 seconds left until the break, and we're going to talk to David Chace on the other side. Stick around. I'm Nikki Colombo, and welcome to the Nikki Colombo Show, and we'll see you on the other side of the break on tfrlive.com.
You're listening to the Truth Frequency Radio Network.
No hate, no hype, no fear.
Back live. I'm your host, Nikki Colombo. Welcome to the Nikki Colombo Show, and we are back with the fantastic ET artist, David Chace. He's telling us all about how he creates these beautiful artwork. David, is there a running theme or pattern that you've noticed with all of your artwork? Give us the goss, what's going on in between, when you get all the descriptions and stuff. Is there any kind of pattern that you've recognized over the years?
Not really. I mean, just that I'm fascinated by what the UFO occupants look like, and inspiration is kind of a difficult thing for me, because I go through these fallow periods, like you leave a field fallow for a year before, so that it can accumulate nutrients and so forth, and I'm just kind of waiting to be inspired by another image, and someone can contact me and describe an alien, but if they can't give a detailed description, if they can't give enough context of the experience, then it's not likely to get me interested. It doesn't give me enough to work with. So, I mean, I need details, and And what really helps is if there's a visual aid, like if they've done a sketch themselves. And I know people are often afraid to draw because they say, well, I suck as an artist or whatever, but anyone can draw. It's just a matter of practice. And even if someone does like kind of not a great illustration for me, as long as they can help me, guide me through the process of doing corrections to it and so forth, any kind of rough sketch or whatever, it generally will help me get started.
Right, okay. And then it's like a refining process, like with Misha's over the years, yeah?
That's about right. It's a lot of back and forth. I ask clarifying questions. I try to come up with, okay, so you say it was this color. Can you find an example? Is there a particular type of fruit or a plant that's the same color? You can describe a shape, and can you say, well, or this skin texture, was it like this species of lizard, or was it more like this species of lizard? That sort of thing.
Yeah, because I've noticed a lot of yours have got a lot of brown in them more than green. And that seems to be a common theme with, which was surprising to me, yeah?
Well, yeah, the reptilians, I'm not sure, none of them are really a pure green that I'm, as far as, like, when I ask people about the color, I've heard, there was one case that's a woman, I just used her initial CS, and her reptilian she described it as a neutral khaki color, which is kind of a yellowish brown, but with a hint of green, and some variation in the color depending on what part of the body and so forth. But then the Garnetts reptilian that we call Vectra was she described it as a mix between a muddy brown and a forest green. So it's a darker color, kind of brownish, but also kind of greenish at the same time. I think Misha Johnston's contact was both a brown and a green. I mean, it was, again, a mix of the two. So some are more yellow, some more brown, more green, some more gray, but it's kind of a mix. And then occasionally you'll hear about like a white one or a red one or some different color, but lots of variations on the color, and rarely do you have just like a pure primary color like a green or something like that.
Okay. And what about the Nordics? What are your can you give us a bit of insights into the Nordics? What do you know about them?
Well, there's a couple women I knew back in the 90s who had been interacting with beings that we would describe as Nordics. In one case, they identified themselves as Pleiadian, coming from at least having a colony in the Pleiades. And in another case, they were Andromedan. They state they're from the Andromeda system was the term they used, although she took that to mean actually the galaxy M31, the Andromeda galaxy. Yeah. The Pleiadian ones in that case I think they were around 6 to 6.5 feet tall. Very, very chiseled features, very handsome, mesmerizing.
Just say that again, darling. You dropped out. Did you say mesmerizing eyes?
That is correct. The eyes mesmerize, intense, and the skin kind of a tan color. So some people say the Nordics are often pale, but in a number of the cases, the skin's actually more of a tan. But the hair is generally blonde, and then the Andromedan, her Nordics would be those ones were closer to 7 feet tall, maybe even a little taller. So they were they were very tall, very, very handsome. The males and the females, very attractive women, and I drew one of them, and she said, well, you made it a little too, she looks a little bit too fat, so trying to get the curves in there, but, not make her, so it's a tricky thing to draw. I don't usually draw humans or human looking beings, but these beings are very human. In one case, she actually described an experience where she had been kind of snubbed by someone. She'd been to a dance and she hadn't been invited to dance, and the Andromedan, it looked like an African American man, so not a Nordic, but one of the same group with the darker skin. He came and he danced with her that evening, just so that she'd feel better about herself. So I mean, so, she's also had the experiences where Greys take her up on a craft, and the Greys are doing things, and the Andromedans may be standing there, and they'll be. She would ask them, well, why do you do that? And they say, well, we're just checking up on you. You're one of our family, and we're checking how you're doing. But so it's like.
That's a common theme, though, isn't it? We're checking up on you, and they do a medical exam, and you're a part of our family, and they seem to be the more benevolent type of, and also healing. There's a lot of healing going on the ships as well that I don't think people are aware about. Have you heard a lot about that?
Yeah, I've heard. I know a woman back in the 90s who told me about how they had fixed a problem with her eyes, and she'd been afraid that she was going to lose her vision, and whatever they did, they corrected that. So, and we wonder why some people get these healings, and other people might be dying of cancer and can beg for healings, and they don't come. And I do have a friend who had she was in a car accident and had an injury, and basically it would affect her for the rest of her life, and she wanted a healing if they would be able to provide that for her, but the message that came was that reversal is not allowed. Like they would have liked to if they could, but they weren't allowed to interfere in her life in that particular way for whatever reason.
Might be a bit of old karma she needs to clear up before she can receive those healings. I'm not sure, but I mean, that's just a speculation. It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's like people, we just don't know what the rules are, like why sometimes people are healed and sometimes people aren't healed. My friend passed away a few years ago. Josie Gallants is another brilliant artist doing very similar work to what I've been doing, and she's also was an abductee and a contactee herself. In the early 90s, I believe it was, she had a tumor in her intestines, some sort of malignancy, and at that point in her life, she was about to say, okay, she'd lived a long life already by that point, and she was about ready to say, okay, I'm done. I'm just going to let this take me, and but they took her to apparently what she describes as a crystal city.
I've heard about that before. Yeah.
The mantis beings there. These mantis beings actually performed surgery and removed the malignancy and treated her, and she was returned, and they explained the reason for it. Well, we still have more work for you to do, and so she produced a great many more illustrations after that. I mean, that I assume that's part of what the work was, and maybe just through her interactions with her family and friends on Earth, that was part of what she was here to do. So they extended her life.
That's beautiful. It's good to hear more of the positive stuff instead of all the negative stuff out there, because we've got to dispel some of this fear that's out there in the UFO community right now, because there's so much. I mean, I can see that it's a program, and I understand, why it's there, but we've got to recognise that so we don't, fall into any of those, fear tactics, which is why I do this show, because I'm sick of hearing everyone saying that they're all negative. It's like the human race, I think generalization is really can get you in a lot of hot water, because people will come back with their own points of view, and you get into some debates about that. We've got to respect other people's points of view and all that kind of stuff. So I mean, that's going to make the world a lot better if we start looking at and respecting other people's points of view, especially in the UFO community, which is it seems to be tearing. There seem to be a lot of tearing apart of each other on the community, especially on the internet right now. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, certainly. This is one of the most frustrating things. It's one of the things that keeps me from maybe engaging as fully as I would if I didn't have to deal with this stuff. But it's the I distinguish between beliefs and experiences. Now, when I talk to people about what they experienced, what I want to know is, what did it look like? What was the context? What was the date, the time? What was going on in your life at the time? And then what did you see? And so I can do a drawing of what the being is. And if they tell me, well, it was a frightening experience, I'll take their word for it. And if they tell me it was a healing and uplifting experience, I'll take their word for it. But as long as then you get the people who are trying to push their beliefs on you, and that, well, but you're not telling me about an experience. You're just telling me about what you think is going on. And a lot of it's not even based on your own experience, but based on something you read on the internet or something. And I just wish more people would learn to distinguish beliefs from experiences, and then to kind of honor everyone's experiences and not say, well, that person's had a positive experience and I know the ETs are all negative, therefore that person must be lying, or they're crazy, or that person had a negative experience and I know the ETs are all positive, so therefore that person's either a liar or they're a government plant or whatever. I wish people could just listen to each other and kind of not get into such extreme positions on it.
Yeah, I think that's that polarity thinking, and there are programs out there which entice people to fall into that negative polarity, thinking that they're all negative, they're all positive, and the actual fact that it's all of that plus in between as well. And like I said before, you just got to respect other people's experiences, because there is, like you said before, there's a big difference between being an experiencer and someone who's describing someone else's experience and just passing it on as fact, when in actual fact it isn't fact, it's actually speculation. And I think that's what the problem is out there is, we've got to really get into people who have had real experiences. And you can feel in your heart whether someone is telling the truth or not, especially if they've got some great detail about their experiences, and they can tell it in a million different ways and still come up with the same experience, compared to people who are out there who just pass along information as fact, stirring up the fear tactics and everything like that, which just aggressors us as a race. Doesn't it, David? We need to be past all this. We really need to, get rid of all that. It's time to grow up, isn't it? That's what I keep hearing. It's time to grow up and get past it,
It would be nice.
Yeah. How are we going to meet people from, off-worlds if we can't even, and be racist about it if we're racist on the planet with our own humans? No wonder they only select certain people to come and visit, because those people are a little bit more advanced in their spirituality. I'm talking from a positive point of view, because their vibration is higher, and I've heard that these ETs come down in vibration while you go up in vibration, and they kind of meet in the middle somewhere and interact on a different level. Have you heard that, David?
I don't know from that angle of it. I can't tell you. Some people have questioned me that, because I, for the longest time, I couldn't really say I was an experiencer, and I would be, so if I talk about something that someone disagrees with, they say, well, who are you to talk? You've never actually seen a being, and that. When I pass on someone else's experience, I try to be as true as possible to what that person communicated to me about their own experience. But still, if I'm passing on something that confronts someone else because it challenges their beliefs, then they may come back, well, you're not an experiencer. How would you know? And okay, yeah, I wasn't. But I did have one experience, fairly recent. That was just in 2015 with, it was I call it invisible apes, and there were a number of people with me. The sad thing is, as someone who's interested in the visual details, I was not able to see these beings because they were invisible. But I could talk about that experience if you're interested.
Yeah, I've had experiences where I have felt little greys in my room, but at the time I couldn't see them with my eyes, but I could feel them. It wasn't until I haven't had a regression with Misha that I could see them from a third point of view, and I wasn't frightened. So I know exactly, where you're at with that. Okay, yeah, take us away with that. I'd love to hear that experience. What happened?
So this was September 2015. We just done. There's a group called Starborn Support that had been doing these conferences annually up in Maine, and they were doing them in Portland, Maine, for the most part. And then afterwards, we would go to this house on a lake, and so it's a rural part of Maine where there's lots of forest and lakes and so forth. And so there were for about a week, 2015, we spent like pretty much a whole week there. It started with, there were about 50 people that first night, and then, people could only stay for so long, and we would basically be camping out in the yard in tents and so forth around this one little house on the lake there. And then by the end of the week, it was getting to be, it was actually Thursday, I believe. It was September 3rd, 2015, that there were just like maybe 7 of us left that afternoon, and about 1:30 p.m., a tree started to fall in the gully, and Audrey, who's there's the twin sisters, Audrey and Debbie, and Audrey called us all out onto the back deck of the house to look at this tree, and so we watched this tree falling, and I'd never seen a tree fall before, and the odd thing about it was it seemed like it was being twisted or pushed or pulled as if some kind of force we couldn't see, something was acting on it. And I was thinking, well, maybe that's just the roots giving way because the soil is loose or something. I don't know. And then we went down to right on the rim of the gully. We didn't want to go into the gully because we didn't want to get crushed while the tree was kind of taking a long time to fall, going a little bit at a time. But then, as the tree was like kind of mostly lying on the ground, all the branches on the at the top kind of formed this big, massive bushes, is what it looked like, and we could see in those branches something would be hop from one place to another, where the branches would sink down under its weight, and then the branches would spring up as it whatever it was would hop a few feet to one side, and then the branches would sink down there, and it really looked like some invisible thing was jumping around in the branches and shaking the branches. And the movements were very much what, it made me think of a large chimpanzee or a small gorilla. And that was around 2 p.m. And then, the activity seemed to quiet down a bit, and we went back up into the house. And at that point, I was willing to believe that, okay, maybe it just looked that way, and what it was actually was tension in the branches, and then the branch would snap, other branches would spring up, and then it would look like something was moving in the branches. But later on that afternoon, I was able to actually go down there. With Lee and Raquel were down there, and we realized it was safe enough that we could probably go down there and watch it at close range. And when I got down there, I saw Lee and Raquel sitting on the ground there in front of the top of the tree that was pretty much lying on the ground. And I saw this big movement in the branches, and I saw, oh, so that's an animal they've been watching this time, because it's definitely the kind of movement is caused by an animal. And so I was looking, okay, so is that a raccoon? No, I don't see a raccoon. And is there a squirrel? No, I don't see a squirrel. Well, it must have been a bird, but there's not a bird there either. And I kept getting to smaller and smaller animals because I wasn't seeing any animals, so it must have been something smaller. But I realized there's nothing there visible. And and this was definitely an animal. So it's like I knew that if it was an animal, I would be able to see the animal, but I also knew that I couldn't see the animal. So it was invisible, and we were there.
It sounds like a paradox, doesn't it? You could see it, yeah.
We sat down there for 40 minutes watching the big movements, like the one that I call the ape or the small gorilla. And then the smaller movements that the first time I saw where the branches would like twitch, and I would think first image popped into my mind was like a marmoset or one of those small South American monkeys. Because so I figured there were at least one or two of the larger creatures, like a small gorilla or a large chimpanzee, and then there seemed to be at least like three or maybe several even of these smaller ones that were creating these monkey-like movements. And of course, we couldn't see anything, but it's the kind of motion that, if the branches move like that, it's either the weight or the muscle strength of an ape or monkey shaking it. It's just like if you had footage of primates, arboreal primates climbing in a tree, monkeys or apes, but then you digitally remove the primates, and all you have left is the movement of the branches. And we watched that for like 40 minutes before the activity kind of quieted down. And that was the most paranormal thing. I mean, it's the only unambiguously paranormal thing I've ever experienced. We couldn't explain it with tension in the branches or with someone with like fishing line hiding behind a bush or something like that. Whatever it was paranormal. And to me, it definitely seemed like living creatures of sort of an ape-like nature, but they were perfectly invisible. We looked for any kind of outline or shadow or heat waves, kind of like if you've seen the movie Predator, how it has this cloaking. You can see it sort of, but we couldn't even see that. It was just like perfectly invisible. It was like an animal that was both there and not there, because there was no sound. It wasn't breathing. We couldn't hear it breathing. We couldn't hear any kind of vocalization. There was no odor coming from it. I mean, usually if you think you're that close to a primate, you would expect to smell something. And there was no odor, there was no sound, but we could definitely see where it had weight and it had physical strength and could move the branches. And that was my experience.
Well, that I wonder if that is a Sasquatch. I wonder if that was Bigfoot coming in and out of dimension for you. Do you feel that?
I've heard that as a possible theory. I think what I can say is I believe it might well be related to Bigfoot, but usually when people describe a Bigfoot, they describe a ground-dwelling creature that is, maybe 8 feet tall, it weighs hundreds of pounds. So whatever this was maybe a couple 100 pounds, the larger ones at most. I mean, they weren't that big, and it seemed more arboreal. It seemed like it was meant to live in these trees, or trees generally. So it might be part of the Bigfoot family. In some sense, it was like a poltergeist. It was like there was nothing there, but like it was causing movement. So the best I can describe it is it was just outside of our dimension of reality. It was like there, but it was not there at the same time.
That's a perfect description, yeah. And I guess that's what a lot of us are feeling at the moment, even though we can't see it with our eyes. We know that it's there because these veils between dimensions are really thinning right now, and a lot of people are seeing a lot of paranormal stuff, but they can't explain it. And I don't think that we should be relying on our eyes for 100% facts, because, all of our senses have to kick in to feel what's going on. When you see these impressions or you have these feelings and you go like, I know there's a presence there, but I don't know exactly what it is. But I know that my inner gut feeling and all my other senses are telling me that something is there, even though my eyes aren't showing me exactly what is there. And I've had many experiences like that. And it's wonderful to go to a regression to discover those wonderful experiences of what we're looking at. So we're going to take a little break, and we'll be on the other side with David Chace, ET artist, and I'm Nikki Colombo, and welcome to the Nikki Colombo Show on TFRlive.com. See you soon.
Truth Frequency Radio is your number one. Wherever you are, make it TFR. Truth Frequency Radio.